I had been working from home for a little over a year when I started getting tired of seeing the same four walls every day. I was spending most of my time in a small apartment with my laptop sitting on the same desk, and after a while, even having weekends free didn't really feel like a break. I'd been putting off using some vacation time, so I decided to rent a cabin for a few weeks and work from there. The cabin was in northern Wisconsin, near Minocqua. I had been up in that part of the state a couple of times before with friends, so I knew what to expect. The place I found was pretty cheap compared with some of the other rentals, and from the pictures it looked comfortable. The owner met me there when I arrived. Seemed like the kind of person who had been renting cabins for a long time. He showed me where everything was, explained the trash situation, and reminded me to lock the doors if I went into town. Before leaving, he mentioned the property behind the trees. There was another house on the neighboring lot. It wasn't directly beside mine, but because the trees were thinner around the back of my property, I could see it from the deck. It looked abandoned. I asked the owner about it mostly because I was curious. "Is somebody living there?" I asked. He glanced toward the property. "No, not as far as I know." He said the house had been sitting empty for quite a while and that the property had changed hands a couple of times. He didn't seem interested in talking about it, so I didn't push. It was actually kind of strange that someone would leave a house in that condition when there were so many vacation properties around the lake. But it wasn't my problem. Since I was working remotely, I didn't have to dress up or do much of anything other than sit at the little table with my laptop. Around noon, I'd make something for lunch, and if I didn't have too much work, I'd go outside for a while. My sister also called me most nights. She thought the whole idea of going somewhere just to work was ridiculous. "You could do that at home," she'd tell me. "So you're basically paying money to have a worse internet connection." Pretty much. She'd laugh, and then we'd talk about whatever was going on with our family. It was a normal trip. The first strange thing happened one night while I was on my laptop. It was around 11. I'd finished working hours earlier, and I was sitting on the couch with the lights mostly off because I didn't like having every light in the cabin on at night. While looking toward the back window, I noticed a faint light between the trees. It took me a second to realize it was coming from the house on the neighboring property. One of the windows was lit up. I sat there looking at it for a while. The house was far enough away, but the light was obvious. It wasn't a reflection from my cabin or something outside. It looked like a normal indoor light. I figured the owner must have been mistaken when he said nobody lived there. I didn't think much more about it. The next morning, there was no sign of anyone. The house looked just as run down as it had when I arrived. A couple nights later, I saw another light. It was in a different window. It stayed on for like 20 minutes before disappearing. It was weird. I didn't have any reason to assume anything worse. When the cabin owner stopped by a few days later to check something outside, I mentioned it to him. "By the way, I think somebody's been in that house." He looked at me. "What makes you say that?" "I've seen lights on in there twice." He seemed confused. "Lights?" "Yeah." He looked toward the trees. Then he said something that stuck with me. "I'm pretty sure there's no power running to that house." He explained that the electricity had supposedly been disconnected years earlier. He didn't know if somebody had hooked it back up, but as far as he knew, the place wasn't connected to anything. I asked him if the property had a new owner. He said he didn't know. That was about as much information as I got. I remember being mildly annoyed by the whole thing. It was just another weird thing about an old property. I wasn't going to walk over there and start looking through somebody's windows, so I left it alone. A few nights later, I was sitting outside on the deck after dinner. It was getting dark, but there was still enough light that I could see the lake. I had my phone with me and was talking to my sister when I saw movement through the trees. Someone was standing in the backyard of the other house. I could only make out his body and the clothes he was wearing. I assumed he was probably somebody who had been staying there or working on the property. The fact that someone was physically there actually made the lights seem less strange. Then a vehicle came down the driveway. It was an older, dark-colored SUV. It stopped near the house, and few people got out. I stopped paying attention to my sister for a second. She asked, "What?" I explained where I was looking. She said something like, "You have neighbors?" Technically, yeah. I didn't think much of the people getting out of the vehicle at first. It was the way they looked that made me keep watching. There were few of them. I think 4. Their clothes were strange and didn't seem to match. One of the men was extremely thin. They weren't dressed like people going to a normal cabin for the weekend. That doesn't mean anything by itself, obviously. People dress however they want. But this group seemed off. They didn't stand around talking or unloading coolers or anything like that. They got out of the vehicle and went straight inside the house. The man who had been standing in the yard went inside with them. I watched for another minute and went back inside. I went to bed that night without giving it much thought. The following evening, though, I heard voices. I was in the living room, and I heard something coming from the direction of the other house. There were several voices. People were talking over each other, but every so often the sound changed. It became more repetitive, like several people were saying the same thing together. It sounded like chanting. I sat there listening because I'd never heard anything like it coming from that property before. Then there was laughter. It sounded scattered. One person would laugh, then another, then someone else would join in. I turned the television back on. I don't know why. I wasn't interested in what they were doing. A few minutes later, I turned it off again. The voices were still there. I went outside. I didn't go all the way to their property. I just walked into my backyard and stood near the trees. The sound was clearer outside. There were definitely several people inside. I couldn't understand a single word. I stood there, then somebody appeared at one of the windows. They were looking toward me. There was no question that they'd noticed me. I immediately looked away. I didn't want to make it obvious that I'd been standing there listening. I started looking toward the lake, as if that had been what I was doing the whole time. I stood there for another few seconds, and then walked back to my cabin. Once I was inside, I locked the back door. I'd basically been standing in somebody's backyard, watching them through the trees. If they'd noticed me, they probably had every right to think I was being nosy. I went back to the couch and tried to continue watching television. About an hour later, there was a knock on the front door. I didn't answer. Another knock. I looked through the window beside the door, but the angle wasn't good enough to see who was standing outside. "Who is it?" "Nothing." I waited. Then the door shook. Someone had hit it. I stood up. Before I could say anything, they hit it again. I backed away from the door. The whole situation changed. Whatever embarrassment I'd felt about watching the other house was gone. Somebody was trying to get into my cabin. The person outside hit the door again. Another hit came against the door. I could hear the wood moving in the frame. I yelled, "What do you want?" There was no answer. I heard voices. Several voices. They were coming from the direction of the other property. Someone shouted something that sounded like, "Stop!" The man at my door stopped hitting it. I could hear people arguing in the yard. I moved toward the side window and looked out. There were few people around the man. It was difficult to see clearly, but I recognized some of them as the people from the other house. One of them grabbed the man by the arm. He resisted. Another person grabbed him from behind. They were all talking at once. I couldn't understand most of what they were saying, but I clearly heard someone tell him to stop. The man kept struggling. Eventually they managed to pull him away from my cabin. They dragged him toward the other house. I remember how strange that looked. These were the same people I'd been watching earlier, and now they were physically pulling a guy away from my door as if they were trying to prevent him from doing something stupid. They weren't apologizing to me. Nobody came over and asked if I was okay. They just got him away from the cabin and took him back toward the house. I figured whoever had tried to break in wasn't going to come back. I locked the door again and went to bed. I couldn't sleep much. The cabin made normal sounds throughout the night. Around 2 a.m, I got up. I was walking toward the kitchen. Something outside the bedroom window caught my attention. There was a person standing there. He wasn't trying to get inside. He was looking through the window. I stopped. He looked at me. Then he turned around and walked away. He just walked off the way someone might walk away after realizing they'd been noticed. I went back to the living room and sat on the couch with my phone. I stayed inside. I barely slept for the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I started packing. I don't think there was anything supernatural involved. Maybe drugs could explain some of the behavior. The house could have been used by people who weren't supposed to be there. The man who tried to break down my door wasn't acting like he'd simply made a mistake. At the time, I was working as an industrial equipment technician. My jobs were somewhere within a few hours of where I lived, but every once in a while I'd get sent farther out to deal with equipment that the local guys couldn't fix. I was usually left alone, and I got to drive around a lot. This job was outside Dalton, Georgia. I was supposed to be there for one day. My supervisor thought I'd be able to diagnose it and get it running again. I got there in the morning, spent most of the day working on it, and eventually figured out that the control board itself was damaged. The replacement part had to be shipped in, though, so there wasn't much I could do until it arrived. My supervisor called me toward the end of the afternoon. "Just stay another night," he said. "Put it on the company card. Get it fixed tomorrow and head home." I wasn't thrilled about it, mostly because I had been looking forward to getting home that evening. My girlfriend and I had plans for the weekend, and I'd already been away from home more than I expected that month. Still, it wasn't a huge deal. I started looking for somewhere to stay nearby. There were a couple of chain hotels closer to the highway, but I ended up finding a small roadside motel a few miles away. I got there around 7:30. The motel was one of those older places where all the rooms opened directly onto the parking lot. There was a small office near the entrance, and the rooms stretched down both sides of the property. It looked like it had probably been built several decades earlier and had been renovated a few times since. There were quite a few cars in the parking lot, including several work trucks and a couple of family-sized SUVs. Behind the motel was a wooded area. The property ended pretty abruptly. There was a narrow strip of grass behind the rooms, and beyond that were trees. It wasn't a huge forest or anything like that. It just looked like an undeveloped piece of land behind the motel. The woman working the front desk looked to be in her 60s. She was friendly, but she had the tired look of somebody who'd been dealing with customers all day. She asked what brought me into town. "Work," I told her. She smiled. "That's usually what brings people here." She handed me a key and pointed me toward the middle of the building. My room was number 14. The room next to mine was number 15. I ended up thinking about that number quite a bit later. The room itself was pretty standard for a roadside motel. 2 beds, an old dresser, a television mounted across from them, a little desk, and an air conditioner built into the wall underneath the window. The air conditioner made a lot of noise. I figured it would probably cover most of the sounds coming from outside. I called my girlfriend while I unpacked. "So you're sleeping in some random motel in Georgia again?" she asked. "Apparently." She laughed. I told her I'd call her later and went out to get something to eat. There was a little Mexican restaurant a few minutes away. I ate there by myself, brought some leftovers back. There were people coming and going, which I preferred. It felt like any other cheap motel I'd stayed in for work. The room next to mine was occupied. I knew that because there was a dark-colored sedan parked directly in front of room 15. I never got a good look at the person who owned it. Around 10:30, I heard the door next to mine open. It wasn't unusual enough for me to pay attention. I assumed whoever was staying there was going outside. A few minutes later, the door closed. I went back to watching television. 20 minutes passed before I heard it again. The door opened, then closed. A little while later, the same thing happened. Eventually, I started noticing it because there didn't seem to be any reason for the guy to keep opening and closing his door. If he was going to his car, I'd hear the car door. If he was going outside to smoke, I'd expect him to stay out there for a few minutes. Instead, the door would open, stay open briefly, and then close again. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured the guy was looking for something in his car or having trouble with his key. It happened enough times that I finally joked about it when I called my girlfriend again. She had fallen asleep during our earlier conversation, so I only talked to her for a few minutes. While we were talking, the door next to me opened again. I stopped in the middle of a sentence. She asked what happened. Nothing. The guy next door keeps opening his door. What guy? The guy in the room beside me. She laughed. I swear he's opened that door like 10 times. We talked for another few minutes before saying goodnight. I brushed my teeth, turned the television down, and got into bed. I remember waking up and seeing 2:07 on the clock. Something had made a noise next door. For a few seconds I wasn't sure what it was. It sounded like somebody dragging something across the floor. There was another sound. It was heavier, like somebody had dropped something. Then I heard a man's voice. The door next to mine opened. This time I was paying attention. I got out of bed and moved toward the window. A man was standing outside room 15. He was wearing dark pants and what looked like a gray sweatshirt or like a jacket. He stood there for a few seconds looking around the parking lot. I assumed he was smoking, although I couldn't see a cigarette. Then he started walking toward the back of the motel. I watched him go past the end of the building. He kept walking until he reached the trees. Then he disappeared. I stayed by the window for some reason. Maybe 5 minutes later, I saw him coming back. He wasn't empty-handed this time. He had a black bag. It looked like a duffel bag. I couldn't be completely sure from where I was standing. It wasn't a little backpack or grocery bag. It looked big enough to hold quite a bit. He carried it in one hand, and the way he was holding it made me think it had some weight to it. He walked straight back to room 15. The door opened. He went inside. Then the door closed. I stood there for a while looking at the room. It was strange, but I didn't know what I was supposed to do about it. I went back to bed. I don't think I was asleep for very long. The door next door opened again. I sat up. Someone walked out of room 15. This person looked different enough that I wondered if there had been two people in the room the entire time. The first man had been tall and thin. This guy was shorter and heavier. The first man had what looked like dark hair, while this guy's hair was either shaved very short or completely covered by the lighting. I watched him walk across the parking lot. He didn't go toward the sedan parked in front of room 15. He just kept walking. He crossed the parking lot, reached the road, and continued down it. I stood there watching until I couldn't see him anymore. The car was still sitting outside room 15. That was what bothered me. If the second man was the person who had been in the room, why hadn't he taken the car? I started wondering whether I had somehow mistaken the first man for the second. I didn't know. I watched room 15 for a few more minutes. Nothing happened. I went back to bed. A little while later, I started hearing someone talking inside the room. It sounded like a phone conversation. I couldn't hear the other person, but the man inside room 15 was clearly upset. His voice kept getting louder. At one point, I heard him swear. Then he said something that sounded like, "Where the hell are you?" I couldn't make out the rest. There was a pause. Then he started cursing again. I was sitting on the edge of my bed by then, listening. I still wasn't sure if I should call the front desk. It could just be somebody having an argument with someone on the phone. Something hit the wall. It was hard enough that I heard a dull thump through the wall beside my bed. A few seconds later, there was another crash. This one sounded like glass breaking. I grabbed my phone. I opened the screen and stared at it for a while. I didn't know what number to call. I had no idea if anyone was actually in danger. Then I heard another crash. This sounded like furniture being knocked over. The man started yelling. I couldn't understand all of it, but he was definitely angry. I got up and moved toward my door, opened it just enough to look outside. The parking lot was empty. Room 15's door was closed. The sedan was still parked there. Nobody was outside. I stood there for like 10 seconds before closing my door again. I didn't want whoever was in room 15 to notice me standing there. I went back to bed. There was more talking from next door. A few more bangs. At one point, I heard something hit the wall so hard that it sounded like it might have gone through it. Then everything became quiet. I checked the time. It was sometime after 4. I stayed awake until close to 5 before eventually falling asleep. When I woke up, it was after 8. I looked toward the window. The car was still there. Room 15 was still closed. I got dressed and packed my things. Before leaving, I stood near the window again. I wanted to see if the man came outside, and took my bags out to my truck and then walked to the office. I told her I'd heard some noise coming from the room during the night. She didn't seem concerned. "People get loud," she said. I went to work. Normally I would have been focused completely on the job, but I kept thinking about room 15, especially the car. It hadn't moved. The second man had walked away. The first man, the woods, the black bag. And after the second man left, someone had still been inside the room. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I'm Hazel. I was living in Colorado Springs when this happened. I had moved to Colorado a little over a year earlier. I wanted a change and had been offered a better job than the one I had back home. I was in my late 20s and living by myself in a small apartment. I didn't know a huge number of people yet, although I had gotten fairly close with a few coworkers. One of them, Kitty, was always telling me that I wasn't taking advantage of living in Colorado. "You moved here and you spend every weekend inside," she'd tell me. Eventually I started going hiking. I wasn't experienced. I didn't own any of the expensive gear that some people seem to have. I had a decent pair of hiking shoes. I was alone. I could go at whatever pace I wanted. If I wanted to stop and take pictures, I stopped. If I wanted to turn around early, I did. I didn't have to worry about whether somebody else wanted to keep going. My mom hated that part. She lived several states away, and whenever I mentioned going hiking alone, she'd ask a series of questions that I'd heard so many times I could almost answer them before she finished. She'd usually sigh and tell me to text her when I got back. That Saturday, I didn't have anything going on, and the weather was good enough that I decided to go on a trail I'd already done twice before. It was somewhere in the Colorado Springs area and had a viewpoint about halfway through the hike. It wasn't one of those extremely remote trails where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. On weekends, there were usually other hikers around. That was one of the reasons I felt comfortable going alone. I remember leaving my apartment a little later than I'd planned because I couldn't find my sunglasses. I eventually found them underneath the passenger seat of my car, which was pretty typical of me. I drove to the trailhead, parked, and saw a few other vehicles already there. I think I started hiking a little after 9. I was mostly listening to music and enjoying the fact that I didn't have anywhere I needed to be. Eventually, I put my phone away because I like being able to hear what's going on around me when I'm hiking alone. I'd learned that from my mom, actually. She'd always tell me that if I was going to hike by myself, I shouldn't have both ears covered with headphones. I used to think she was being overly cautious, but it became a habit. I passed 2 women going in the opposite direction, then a man carrying a small child on his shoulders. A little farther up, I passed an older couple who were heading back toward the parking lot. I remember thinking it was a pretty good day to be outside. The trail wasn't too crowded, and I wasn't in any particular hurry. I was somewhere around 40 minutes into the hike when I heard footsteps behind me. There was nothing unusual about hearing another person walking behind me on a hiking trail. I assumed somebody was simply moving at about the same speed I was. Every so often I'd hear the crunch of shoes against dirt and loose rocks. I figured whoever it was might want to pass me, but they didn't. The footsteps stayed behind me. I kept walking, and after another minute I glanced over my shoulder. The trail curved behind me, and there was nobody immediately visible. I figured the person was farther back than I thought. I kept going. A few minutes passed before I heard the footsteps again. They seemed closer. I looked back a second time and still couldn't see anyone. It was slightly strange. There are a lot of little sounds on hiking trails that don't necessarily come from exactly where you think they do. Someone could have been walking on a parallel section of the trail. The terrain could have been carrying the sound. I didn't want to keep turning around every 30 seconds. The viewpoint wasn't much farther, so I decided I'd just keep going. When I reached it, I took my backpack off and stood near the railing for a few minutes. I drank some water and took a picture with my phone. There was a pretty good view from up there, and I remember looking around for a place to sit. I heard the footsteps again. They had stopped. I turned around. Nobody was standing on the section of trail behind me. I could see far enough that I should have been able to spot another hiker if they were close. There was nobody. I remember thinking that the person had stopped when they saw me looking back. It didn't make much sense, but I wasn't going to stand there trying to solve it. I put my water bottle away and looked out over the area below the viewpoint. There was a steep section underneath it, and farther down there was another path running through the terrain. There I saw a man. He was far enough below me. What caught my attention was that he wasn't moving. He was standing in one spot, looking up toward the viewpoint. I watched him for a few seconds. He wasn't taking a picture. He wasn't looking around. He wasn't talking to anyone that I could see. He was standing there, looking up. I remember wondering if he'd seen me looking down at him. There was no way I could tell from that distance. I looked away and started getting my backpack back on. When I looked down again, he was still there, where he'd been. There was no reason for me to assume anything worse. So I started back down the trail. For the first few minutes, I didn't hear the footsteps. I figured whoever had been behind me had either taken another route or stopped somewhere. I walked at a normal pace and checked my phone once. I remember putting my phone into my pocket and thinking I was probably going to stop somewhere for lunch afterward. Everything had gone back to feeling normal. Then I saw someone ahead of me on the trail. It was the same man. At least I was almost certain it was. He was standing in the middle of the trail, far enough ahead that I couldn't make out his face yet. My first thought was that he'd come up from another part of the trail. I slowed down. He didn't move. I kept walking a little farther. There was something about the way he was standing that made me hesitate. He wasn't looking at the scenery or checking his phone. He was facing directly toward me. I stopped. He stopped. I couldn't tell if he was watching me because of the distance, so I stood there for a few seconds trying to figure out what I was looking at. Eventually I decided to keep walking. I was still telling myself there was probably nothing to worry about. As I got closer, I noticed something about his face. He was wearing a mask. It wasn't a normal mask or something that looked obviously fake from a distance. It looked like a real human face. I couldn't even understand what I was seeing. The skin appeared to have a normal human tone, and the features were shaped like an actual person's face. But the closer I got, the more obvious it became that it was a mask. It's like those realistic silicone masks you see in movies. The face didn't look like his real face at all. I stopped walking. The trail behind him was empty. I took a small step backward. He took a step toward me. I turned around and started walking in the opposite direction. I heard his footsteps behind me. I sped up. The footsteps sped up. I looked over my shoulder and saw him coming after me. He wasn't wearing the mask halfway off or anything like that. I could still see that strange fake face looking in my direction as he followed me. I started running. I didn't think about calling the police at that point. I didn't think about anything except getting away from him. The trail was much harder to run down than it had been to walk up. There were loose rocks and uneven sections, and I was carrying my backpack, which kept bouncing against me. I nearly went down once when my foot slipped. I caught myself and kept moving. The man was still behind me. I looked back again and saw him running. I didn't know what he wanted. I didn't know who he was, and didn't know why he was wearing a realistic human face mask. I just knew he was chasing me. I started yelling. I think I may have yelled for help once, but I was having trouble breathing and talking at the same time. I was terrified that I was going to fall. The worst part was knowing that if I fell, I wouldn't have much of a chance of getting away from him. I kept running downhill. Then I saw another person coming toward me. It was a man jogging uphill. I remember seeing him and thinking, thank God. I started waving at him. He slowed down because he obviously realized something was wrong. I finally managed to say, there's a guy behind me. He's chasing me. The jogger looked past me. The masked man had stopped. He was still on the trail behind us. The jogger asked, where? I pointed toward him. The man in the mask stood there for a few seconds. Then he turned around and started walking away. The jogger stayed with me. He asked me if I was okay, and I said no, not really. He told me to stay beside him while he called the police. I explained everything from the footsteps to seeing the man below the viewpoint, finding him on the trail, noticing the mask, and then being chased. Officers asked me what the mask looked like. I told him it looked like a real human face. He asked me if I could describe the face itself. I couldn't. That sounds strange, but I couldn't remember what the face looked like in enough detail. It looked wrong. I remembered the color and the fact that it looked extremely realistic. The officers went farther down the trail to look for him. They didn't find him. They checked the area around the viewpoint and the lower section where I'd seen him standing, but there was no sign of him. What I couldn't stop thinking about was how long he might have been following me before I ever saw him. If those footsteps had actually been his, he'd been somewhere behind me while I was walking toward the viewpoint, and I hadn't seen him. I hadn't heard him clearly enough to know exactly where he was. I had just assumed he was another hiker.